Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry P. Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. Also at the Hillsdale College Podcast Network, check out the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, The Larry P. Arnn Show, and more, all at podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Good morning, Glory America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt. That music means it's time for the Hillsdale Dialogue. All things Hillsdale can be found at hillsdale.edu. All of the previous Hillsdale Dialogues are collected at hughforhillsdale.com. This week and next, we are doing Book 4 of Plato's Republic with Dr. Daniel O'Toole, a professor in political theory at Hillsdale College. There you see him. My picture is frozen for some reason, but that's just the vagaries of the internet. We'll keep it on you, Daniel. Normally, Dr. Arnn joins us, and then when he doesn't, he comes back and criticizes everything we do. So I'm going to put all the pressure on you. I'm going to tell you that my favorite line in Book 4 is that we've had a hard swim through that. When Socrates says to his collected gathering, boy, that was difficult. And I said, yes, that was. I kind of am glad that he knows that. How do your students react to that? We've had a hard swim through that.
Yeah, I think they feel some relief that others feel that this is quite an abuse and topsy-turvy, and you're on a roller coaster the whole time. Yeah, so, there are a lot of strange arguments that are made throughout the whole book, and including here in Book 4.
Let's begin with the first half of Book 4. This segment, which is the 8th in our series on Plato's Republic, is about Book 4. But Book 4 really has two parts. The first part is about the city, and the second part is about the soul. Do you want to explain what Socrates is trying to do here?
Sure, yeah. And if I could cheat a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about Book 3. I recall there's some things that we haven't talked about with Book 3 that are related to what we get into with Book 4. What we're seeing is Socrates leading, again, Glaucon and Adeimantus, Plato's brothers, in founding the truly just city. And in Book 3, the theme was the education, especially of the ruling elite, the guardians, and what we saw is that it turns out establishing a proper social hierarchy is a rather difficult thing. The most important thing, the most fundamental thing, is the education of the ruling men. But it turns out you need more than that. And one of the things that Socrates does is he attempts to make it so that the ruling men do not naturally prey upon the many, and that the many are not naturally envious of the ruling men. And this is the typical problem that you see in political life. The typical problem of factionalism is a sort of contest between an oligarchic few and a more popular many that doesn't have the great wealth and resources and connection that the few have. And the great solution to that problem, or the primary solution, again, is education. But a secondary solution, which is almost as important, is restricting how much the ruling men can own. In fact, what we discover is that Socrates recommends more or less barrack life for the ruling men. He says the ruling men are going to live in an armed camp. There's going to be a sort of communism of resources, and the only thing that they're paid with are rations. So the many are able to have private property and to make money and to have private homes. But the few, that is the warriors and the rulers, are going to only and exclusively have common messes, and they're going to live in barracks. And there's a question, well, how do you justify this strange arrangement? How is it that you convince the ruling men that this is a good situation for them?
And so, Daniel, has this ever been tried? I mean, you just alluded to There are three classes in the just city: artisans, the working bees, the soldiers, and the kings or the rulers. And these three classes are there. Has this actually ever been tried anywhere to your satisfaction that, like Sparta? I don't think Sparta was this. Did anyone ever do it the right way?
Nobody ever strictly did this. I mean, as I understand, there are primitive societies, maybe in the Greek world and elsewhere, where sometimes you see develop a kind of war band, a group of men in particular who have a great deal of power within the community and arms, but are moderate and limited and don't normally take advantage of the few, at least for a certain period of time. But I think in all cities, more or less, those with arms also end up being those with the greatest resources and power. There's always a kind of oligarchic element to any city that's ruled by a military elite, as this one is. I mean, inevitably, those with arms take and hoard up wealth for themselves.
So Socrates knows this, obviously. He's been a soldier. Why go through the long exercise of describing the just city then, if in fact it's never existed before and it's unlikely to exist in the future? Why do that, Professor?
Right. I think you're right. I mean, that's the massive question throughout the book. And I think you could say this. He's attempting to think through what would truly satisfy men, and thinking it through in terms of what would satisfy men, given the fact that human beings are different by nature. I mean, that many men, you could say, are basically conservative, happy, making money, taking care of themselves and their family. But a few men are uniquely ambitious and intelligent and want more. They want a nobler, more impressive, more honorable, more challenging existence. And those men often, for good or ill, drive society. So the question is, well, you come up with an arrangement that would channel their passion, their ambition, and their idealism. Hence, what they themselves want to live in a just community and be the men who help create the conditions of justice and preserve it. Could you come up with a society that truly satisfies what it is that men as a whole and ambitious men in particular want? And to some extent, it turns out you can come up with a standard or model that we can aspire to. And so partly the Republic becomes a kind of high model for us to look to, even if we realize we can't achieve something like it. On the other hand, as I've been trying to indicate throughout this discussion or throughout our discussions, to some extent, what is demanded in order to realize perfect virtue and realize perfect justice and realize the perfection of virtue throughout the whole community is so demanding and cuts so much against the grain of our normal desires and passions that it's not possible. And in fact, the attempt to realize it would do great violence to the good things that we normally experience. So
that's how it's played out in the 20th century and to the extent in the 21st century.
I think so.
Is that we had elites.
I would say to some extent, it really chastens our political idealism. Though, I mean, we'll get into this. I think the idealism that's sketched out here is somewhat different from what you see in sort of typical political idealism from the French Revolution on, which is more fundamentally egalitarian. This is an inegalitarian, one might say quasi-fascist form of political idealism.
When did the break, I know Machiavelli's the break, but when did people realize that the Republic just doesn't work? You really can't try this because it's not human nature. When did that realization dawn on people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I as far as I can tell, in the ancient world, there wasn't really an effort to realize something like Plato's regime. There was an expectation that some of the philosophers and some of Plato's students might be good rulers, or they might be good advisors to tyrants. But as far as I can tell, anybody reading the Republic, whether because they were in on the joke in the Republic or just because they had some common sense, realized that some of the demands of the regime just were not possible. And the most radical demand is what we'll talk about maybe in a few sessions, but ultimately the abolition of the family for the ruling class. You simply, nobody wants to abolish the private family. Nobody wants to wholly channel or direct their passion and ambition towards serving the city and not toward privileging and protecting their own, including their own children.
Hold it right there, Daniel O'Toole. We'll be right back with the professor, continuing our conversation about Plato's Republic. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All of our prior conversations about Plato's Republic and all previous Hillsdale dialogues at hughforhillsdale.com. Come right back.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Hillsdale Dialogue is underway. Professor Daniel O'Toole and I continue our conversation about Plato's Republic. All of the previous episodes in this study of the Republic available at hughforhillsdale.com. Everything Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. We were talking about people who want the ideal regime, Daniel.
As far as I can tell, it wasn't until the Ayatollah Khomeini who apparently read Plato, the Quran has guardians, and he kind of thought, well, let's have something like an Islamic Platonic regime. As far as I can tell, no one else in the history of
That's interesting, Daniel.
Really sought to realize this regime. Yeah,
you're right. There is an Islamic supreme leader surrounded by a supreme council, underneath which there's an army within an army, the IRGC. They have an expeditionary force, the Quds Force, and then there's an Iranian army, which is different from the Guardians, which is more like the artisan class. But they haven't. It's the opposite of getting rid of wealth. It's a kleptocracy at bottom. Right. They're all getting rich at the top of the Iranian Revolution. That is, at least in the first part of Book 4, that's the need for greed has been trained out of the Guardians and the rulers, right?
Yeah, or that's what they've attempted to do. I mean, partly you could say through the famous noble lie, which is for the city as a whole, and it seems like will have an effect on the ruling class in time. But it's a way of teaching men the noble lie. This is, Socrates says, look, after admitting that, look, men don't want to believe falsehoods, including especially the wise men who rule the city. Socrates says, well, we are going to need a noble lie. And it's his way of suggesting even the most rational city needs a sort of irrational foundation. And that irrational foundation is essential to fortify the notion that one's own good is synonymous with the good of the city. That is precisely that men shouldn't seek extra wealth and privileges and power for themselves, including the elite, but they should fundamentally serve the city and see their own good bound up with it. And so Socrates says, look, we're going to have a kind of funny religious foundation to the regime. Men should see themselves as having been born of the earth and educated of the earth. That is, uniquely bound to this here plot of land. It's a sort of sacred ground that they've grown from, and their fellow citizens aren't just other men, they're their brothers. And so they're bound to serve their fellow brothers as if they're bound to serve and love a family. And so Socrates is especially attempting to fortify the patriotism that the regime needs. And that patriotism, of course, is supposed to check against the individual self-seeking. And then
now, he also does at the beginning. Now we're into book 4. He's trying to build. I reconciled this at the end, Daniel, when I got done by saying, first part of book 4 is all about setting up the second part of book 4, because he's really talking to individuals about how to manage their soul. He's not talking to real people about how to run a city. And I want you to correct me if he really was talking about people trying to run a real city. I just viewed it as a device to illustrate how people ought to live their own lives. Am I wrong? Was he really trying to persuade people this is the way to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, yes, he is giving genuine advice about how to run a city. It's all somewhat extreme, but I have to admit that much of what he says. Well, yes, but what I was going to say is that in some ways, the many of the things that he says here in book 4 are in fact sensible. And so I think decent or healthy advice, though no regime can simply follow the basic advice that he recommends. But there's, for instance, there's a recommendation that the city remain, you could say, a closed society. That is, there's a strong recommendation that innovation and bringing in outside ideas and changes to the educational system, the music, the poetry that makes up the regime, bringing in immigrants, right? That changes the character of the regime. So all of those things, Socrates suggests, these are potential problems. And if you have a fundamentally healthy city, you should seek to fortify it and keep it closed from the outside, as conservative as possible.
Hold it right there, Professor O'Toole. With that thought, keep it strong, keep it fortified. We'll be back with more of this edition, an episode on Plato's Republic, Professor Daniel O'Toole. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All previous Hillsdale dialogues at hughforhillsdale.com. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, reading along in the Republic with Dr. Daniel O'Toole as this edition of the Hillsdale Dialogue continues. We've been talking about the Republic for a long time, and Professor, I've got favorites in there. Adiamantus is my favorite guy thus far, because at one point he says, you know, these guardians in the just city, they're not going to be very happy, Socrates.
Right.
They're drawing the short straw. Right. They don't get anything.
Yeah. Well, that's true and it's not true. Yeah, that's a big complicated question. Why would this be worthwhile for the guardian? Socrates' official position in response to Adiamantus, which you could say pacifies him for the time being, is that, look, we're building a just city. That means what we care about is the happiness of the city as a whole, not the happiness of the parts. And he gives this kind of beautiful image of the city as a kind of noble entity. And he compares it to a beautiful statue. And he says, look, you're not coloring the eyes with the most beautiful colors with purple. You color the eyes with what's appropriate as fitting parts or members of that city. So he kind of reminds you, look, Adiamantus, the guardians should see themselves as serving a greater whole. This happy whole, this beautiful whole. And I would say this, to some extent, that itself speaks to the ambition of ruling men, maybe especially to a man like Glaucon. It tells them, look, you want what's greatest in life? There's something greater than wealth and riches and power and so forth. There is the beauty of a city, of a community that you serve and devote yourself to and build. So that alone, you could say, is they sort of channel the great ambition and longing toward nobility toward the city. They channel the ambition of the ruling men towards serving that. And so getting that opportunity itself is to some extent satisfying. Now,
well, Daniel, you're a teacher. How do you teach young people in your classes you don't really want a lot of money? I mean, that just doesn't work very well in America, does it? You know, wealth. Right. We need wealth because if you get wealthy, you can patronize the arts. And there's an argument here about why we need wealth in the city. But if you're talking to the elite at Hillsdale, do you try and persuade them that they really don't want to make money?
Well, I don't go that far. I mean, but I remind them that it's not the thing that they desire simply, nor, I mean, I guess you remind them, first of all, that one could become obsessed with money making, and that one could think that money is a kind of stand-in for honor or intelligence, which sometimes it maybe loosely is, but nobody serious really just wants a life of comfort and luxury. They want to do something difficult and important, and they want esteem from other like-minded, intelligent men. So I remind them of that, though. There's a kind of hard-headedness about the utility of money, and in our regime, as it falls apart, it makes a lot of sense to think through how you're going to protect yourself, and resources are one way to protect yourself and your family.
Now, if you're one of America's burgeoning billionaire class, and we have a billionaire class now, which is the long-term effects of which are going to be very interesting to observe. And I've gotten to know a couple of these billionaire class people a little bit. What do you think they take away from this? That they ought to give all their money away, or that Socrates doesn't think highly of them? It's a pretty strange message. If you're sitting around on top of $1 billion or 20 billion, and you read the opening of the Republic, you're going to realize Socrates doesn't think much of you.
Right. Well, I don't know if he doesn't necessarily think much of the wealthy, but he certainly understands the dangers of wealth for a city. I mean, I suspect that most of the billionaires that you know, and I know many wealthier people who are connected to Hillsdale College who give a lot of money, most of them are public-spirited and morally serious, and they want to use and devote their wealth to high causes and important things, especially to charities, to education, to preserving the arts, and then, of course, to political causes, because they realize in our political situation there's a massive fight and the good guys need resources. So I don't think anything like that is that Socrates in practical circumstances would recommend against. But I do think he understands that there's a basic problem in the soul with somebody who simply wants to acquire wealth and money. And there are many of those people in our ruling elite. And he very much understands that in a political regime, inequality of that sort is always dangerous. Always, eventually, the ruling class starts to extract more and more from the people and neglect their needs. And I think that happens in our own. I think the sort of radical, you could say, embrace of globalization and outsourcing and depleting America's manufacturing base was somewhat foolish and partly done for greedy reasons, and has harmed the American worker. The embrace of immigration has done that, and has changed the country. So those are problems. And then likewise, there's the envy. There's the sort of socialist temptation that the few who look at the many wealthy have and think we got to take from that. And that's the normal political problem, is that hostility and tension between the few and the many. Of course, what Socrates is trying to do is say, look, this is going to be the one city that finally overcomes that basic factional problem. And his recommendation is not to have a regime that's too poor or too wealthy, both for foreign and domestic reasons. I think he thinks that, look, if you have too much wealth in the regime, you naturally have the factional problem. And also, you end up becoming a target of other countries, and you end up embroiling yourself in foreign conflicts that do a lot of damage to your own country. So he recommends a kind of moderate wealth, which maybe itself is too extreme and not possible. But again, one can see why that makes a certain sense, and why a regime that's too much devoted to wealth making is always going to have factional problems, and ultimately going to undermine the laws and spiritual condition of it.
Well, that's where
so all those
the one big gap in Book 4 is he lays out the 4 key things for a city, which are wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. But he says we can't have too much money. We need enough money for the arts, but we can't have too much money. He doesn't talk about people who accumulate wealth, though. And does he ever do that in the book about their generational wealth? Well, I'm thinking in the last month, the Soros organization bought 200 radio stations. And it was just another effort by Soros to control the means of production of political speech. And it's dangerous. It's nothing that we can control. Yes. It's protected by the First Amendment. But it's a concentration of messaging power that's very dangerous. I just don't think you can ever control wealth adequately, because I also don't want a wealth tax, because it destroys the ability of a country to grow. Yeah.
And for people to maintain and protect healthy families, right? Yeah, no, I think you speak very nicely to the two dangers and temptations, both the sort of socialism that the left seeks, and yet on the other hand, the danger of an oligarchic class. And it is true. I mean, of course, in our regime, most of the wealthy, most of, say, the oligarchs, are on the side of the left in a way, and really sort of seek to preserve and protect their privileges while advancing at the same time a kind of dangerously egalitarian agenda. You could say there's a pincer movement from the marginalized few and the wealthy over and against normal working class citizens.
Do you think, Daniel, that some on the left are actually trying to pull this off, where they use their resources to create a dependent class or an artisan class, and they use their resources to make sure there's a military that is adequately funded, full of warriors who are drawn to it naturally? Most of America's military class, which is professional, comes from military families. It's very much almost a caste system now. And then there's this hyper wealthy. It was never. I'll use one illustration. A friend of mine who's a college president told me that when he began his tenure 30 years ago, 20% of the alumni gave 80% of the money. And the biggest change over his tenure is that 1% of the alumni now give 99% of the money. And that's bad for a college. It's got to be bad for a country, too.
Bad for a country. Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that sort of spirit of giving is going away. From what I understand, maybe you know more about this, that the boomer generation still had a sort of sense, still has a sense that you make great wealth and you should give it back, and that subsequent generations don't quite have that. Maybe partly because those subsequent generations don't feel as secure, but also maybe they haven't quite learned the importance of giving back. So I think both of those things are going to be a problem, including for those of conservatives and the institutions we want to maintain in the future. It's not obvious that you're going to have the same sort of spirit of giving back, partly because more and more people, I think, in this country think, look, I got to look out for myself. Rightly or wrongly, I think we are more selfish and less public spirited, partly because we feel like, look, the public is at war with itself.
Well, I think that's why you see a rise in people going to business school over law school. I really do think people don't want to rule so much. They want to accumulate wealth. That's fine. We are free market people, but we'll talk about what that means more with Professor O'Toole when we come back. Before we go anywhere, though, go to hillsdale.edu for all things Hillsdale.
Hey there. Today, I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu, or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back, America. If you just walked in, you have no idea what's going on here. It's called the Hillsdale Dialogue. We do it every single week, final radio hour of the week. This week I am joined by Professor Daniel O'Toole. He and I, and sometimes the president of Hillsdale, Dr. Larry Arnn, are working our way through Plato's Republic, the beginning of political theory, really. And we're up now to the end of, I think, the first half of Book 4, Professor O'Toole. Daniel, we got about 5 minutes left in this segment about Chapter 4, the beginning. Would you stick the dismount on Part 1? Because there's a transition. It's really kind of sharp in this book where they go from talking about the ideal city to talking about the individual soul. Why is it set up this way?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the official agenda, which is we're going to discover what justice in the city looks like so that we can discover justice in the soul. I think that agenda is, as I indicated, I don't know, many sessions back, not exactly the real agenda of the Republic. I mean, I think it's true that they want to discover what health in the soul looks like, and ultimately what a just and moral soul is, to discover whether a just and moral soul is happy. So that is, and you could kind of do that through the analogy of seeing order and health in a community and then applying what you see to the individual.
Well, what is the real agenda then? What is the real agenda?
Or the primary agenda? What I think is more important is the realization that justice always involves seeking to build or preserve a good and healthy community. And just and serious men want to do that work. They want to have a place in serving and preserving and building a just community. And so the real agenda is to ask the question, well, what should that look like? What would that look like? Does it make sense? Can you preserve a good community? And in doing that work of attempting to realize a just society, do you ultimately serve your own individual good? So the question that we started this session talking about, whether the guardians are happy, that, it turns out, is not a question that you can punt on or act like is unimportant. In fact, you ultimately, to talk about a happy city, really, when you think about it rationally, means you have to have happy members. And so there's the question then, is in building the just city, in doing the work of building the just city and then the life of that city as a whole, does it actually make its members, including especially its best members, happy? And my suggestion was partly because it gives them a real serious moral education. It gives them a cause to devote themselves to, which is higher and greater than wealth making. And it of course gives them great honors. I mean, that's one thing that Socrates starts to stress in Book 3 and returns to in Book 5. But the ruling men who serve the city well are uniquely honored and given great burials and so forth. So there
what's interesting, and here we'll close. In 250 years of the American Republic, even in the Articles of Confederation years, but through the years of the Constitution, our military class has never once lurched for power. It's kind of interesting they hit that where they are satisfied with the honor that they are given rightly by almost everyone in the society. I want to give you the last minute to comment on that, Daniel.
No, that's exactly right. And I mean, that you could say the attempt in this city is to channel and direct that passion. Serious, ambitious men want to serve, and they are mostly satisfied with honor, and in a way that they more long for that than merely wealth and luxury. And so what Socrates says here is, look, you want to have a truly just society. Let's make the whole ruling class live like a noble band of military men and warriors, where they get the offices and the opportunities and the honor that are most important to them, and sacrifice the wealth that ruling elites normally hoard up for themselves that lead to all the problems that we discussed.
That is the conclusion of Part 1 of Book 4. Daniel O'Toole will be back next week as we do Part 9 of our series on the Republic, which is the second half of Book 4. Do not miss it. Don't go anywhere in America except over to hillsdale.edu. Now that I think about it, that was part 9. Coming up next week, part 10 of our conversation about Plato's Republic. The translation, remember, is by Allen Bloom. Here's the book. They're all my notes. The Republic of Plato, Allen Bloom, ALLANBLOOM. It's in paperback. You want to catch up with us, we'll be reading book 5 next week. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I do. Thank you, Professor O'Toole. Coming back next week with more.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.